Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Folke Bernadotte Memorial Library. On behalf of all of the librarians, I just want to welcome you today to the library. We are so glad that you are here. My name is Amber Pierdinock, and I am a candidate for the visiting instructor and academic librarian position here at Gustavus Adolphus College. I use she, her pronouns. My email is amberpierdinock@gmail.com. Please feel free to email me anytime after our class today if you have any questions that you still like to work through, or if you just want to talk more about research. My whole job is centered around helping you succeed. So please feel free to reach out to me, and we can meet over Zoom, over email, or over the phone, whatever works best for you. While today's teaching demonstration will only show a small portion of my teaching, I wanted to take a moment to quickly walk through my full lesson plan for the class. I like to begin each class with a quick welcome and introduction to the library website, showing students the different ways that they can find help in the library. I then like to go into an anonymous poll using Mentimeter, which is a digital polling tool, asking students how they feel about doing academic research. We will then go into a discussion about the different types of sources and what makes a source credible. We will then transition into an active learning activity where students will look at multiple sources and determine whether or not they would use that source in their op-eds. We would then end class with the database demonstration using Academic Search Premier, followed by time for open searching and a quick evaluation, where I would ask students, what is one new thing that they learned about doing research today? So by now in class, you probably have heard a lot about needing to use scholarly or peer-reviewed sources in your op-eds, but what does that mean exactly? How do you know if a source is scholarly or not? So scholarly sources or peer-reviewed sources are articles that are published in academic journals. They are written by scholars who are considered experts in their field, like a college professor, for other scholars to read. This is a really important thing to keep in mind when reading a scholarly source. And that's because scholarly sources make a lot of assumptions of their readers and assume that you as the reader already has a background knowledge that's needed to read the article. So they don't always take the time to define certain key terms or events that are considered common knowledge within the field. This does not at all mean that you are not capable of understanding a scholarly source, but it can be beneficial to do a little bit of background research before you get started in a database, especially if you're doing research on a topic that is new to you. The scholarly sources also go through something called the peer review process. So after an article is written by an author, it will get submitted to a journal, where other experts in the field will review the article and then give the author feedback on the article before it can be published in the journal. This process is incredibly slow. I'm personally going through this process right now, and I have an article that is in the peer review process that was written in 2019, and it probably is not going to get published until 2021 because it has been spending 2020 in the peer review process. But in contrast, popular sources are sources that are written for the general public. Some examples of popular sources could be newspaper articles, magazine articles, or blog posts. So popular sources are really great to use for background research, and because they're written in a more accessible way than a scholarly source is. Popular sources also gives a lot of different perspectives on a topic that you aren't going to find in a scholarly source, because those are intended for an academic audience. They're also published a lot faster than scholarly sources are. So if you're doing research on a super recent topic, please keep in mind that you might only be able to find popular sources because the scholarly sources are still going through that peer review process that we talked about earlier. Popular sources can be excellent sources to use for your research. However, you should always check with your instructor first to make sure that the popular sources are acceptable for your assignment. What's important to remember is that scholarly does not always mean better in terms of sources. Yes, you will have to use scholarly sources to write your op-eds for class, However, there are some truly excellent and credible popular sources that can also be really helpful in your research. Research is going to look different for everyone, and it is a trial and error process, which we'll see when we do our database demo a little bit later in class. And it's always important that you keep your research topic in mind, especially when you're determining the credibility of a source. You can have two objectively credible sources right in front of you, but depending on what your research topic is, one of them might be more credible in your research than it would be for somebody else. So I have been throwing around the terms article, journal, and database a lot during today's class, and I want to make sure that everyone has an understanding of what these terms mean before we move forward. So first we have an article, which is written by a scholar and goes through the peer review process and then gets published in a journal. Now, a journal, you can kind of think of it as similar to a scholarly magazine where it gets published so many times per year like a magazine, and it's filled with these scholarly articles. Journals can be published in physical print copies or online. However, you will most likely see these articles found online and these journals online. What I think is really cool about journals is that they can be so hyper-specific to a small portion of a subject area, which we're going to see later in our database demonstration. Now, a database is a searchable system that has access to journals. So the article gets published in the journal, which is then searchable through the database. Does that make sense to everyone? Great. So as a Gustavus student, you have access to these databases that the library pays buckets and buckets of money for. So searching in a database from the library's website is the best way to look for scholarly articles. If you try to look for scholarly sources on Google, and if you are able to find them, chances are you are going to be met with a paywall, which will ask you to pay money to read the full article. And this is because journals require a subscription in order to access their articles. However, if you search for scholarly articles using the library's databases, the library has already taken care of that payment through our subscription with the database, which has access to the journals. And we're going to look at a database in our class today called Academic Search Premier, which is one of my favorite databases to look through. So now that we've talked a little bit about the difference between scholarly and popular sources and the difference between an article, a journal, and a database, I want us to talk a little bit more about what do you think about when you think about the credibility or the authority of a source? So I pose this question to you. What makes a source credible? Let's head over to the Google Jamboard and see your responses. All right. Awesome. So we have got a lot of great responses here, and let's unpack some of these. So yeah, the author and their background is an incredibly important thing to think about when determining credibility. Is this someone who knows a lot about a topic? It can always be worth to do a quick Google search of an author and see what their credentials are about a subject area to give you some idea of their background. This will also give you an idea of any biases that an author has. However, we are going to come back to that idea in just a minute. So someone brought up a great point about when something is published. So depending on your research topic, you might want to look at some older sources, but it's always important to keep in mind, when was something published? Is the information that you are looking at out of date at this point? So a few people also mentioned that where a source was published is important for determining the credibility. Was it published in an academic journal? Or is it from a newspaper? Or is this from somebody's personal blog? Where a source is published is extremely important when thinking about its credibility, because it can determine who that intended audience is for the source and give you, as a researcher, some idea of what to expect from the source. This is where we can get into the .gov and .edu types of websites like somebody mentioned. So Yeah, we also want to think about what kind of source is this? Is this a scholarly source? Is this a popular source? Or maybe is this something totally different, like a government source? So earlier, someone had mentioned the bias of a source, and I want to come back to that because I feel like the term bias gets a really bad reputation in research because every single source you look at is going to have some sort of inherent bias or perspective based on the author of the source, where it was published, and how that information is being presented to you as the researcher. This is why it's so important for you as students that you develop these critical thinking skills to evaluate sources that you find in your research, and why it's important to have diverse perspectives in your sources. Bias does not always need to be a bad thing, but it is something to keep an eye on. Okay, so I promised you we were going to spend some time in databases later, and it's later. So are y'all ready to look at some databases? Great. So before we get started looking in databases, there are a few things that I just want you all to remember. Every source is going to have some sort of bias of some sort. Bias does not always mean bad, but it is important to recognize. Credibility does not look the same for every single source, and it's important to keep your research question in mind when you're determining the credibility of a source. If I am writing an op-ed about the gender pay gap in professional sports, for example, a popular source that is an interview with the US women's soccer team could be just as credible as a scholarly source about the same subject. So even if you don't remember everything that we discussed today, and I know we talked about a lot, always remember to just keep asking questions about your source. Asking questions will get you to start thinking critically about the information that you're seeing and allow you to start to draw your own conclusions about research. And finally, I want you all to remember that you can do this. Yes, research is a trial and error process, but you are all capable of doing it. And if you have any questions about anything at all, please feel free to contact me and we can work through your questions together. Okay, so we are going to spend a majority of our time doing a database demonstration in Academic Search Premier. I really like Academic Search Premier because it is a multidisciplinary database and it's going to pull from a lot of different journals about different topics in its searches. So I can find Academic Search Premier on our library's website by clicking on Databases on the home page and then entering my Gustavus login information. So you can see that Gustavus subscribes to a bunch of different databases that can be specific to certain subject areas, which could also be helpful for you in your future research. So one of the biggest differences between searching in a database and searching in Google is that in a database, searching requires you to search via keywords or phrases, while Google will let you search via a full sentence. Part of that trial and error process in research that I was mentioning earlier is coming up with the right keywords for your search. It is totally okay if you need to try this a couple of times before you get the right keywords. So like I mentioned, journals being hyper-specific to certain subject areas, databases can also be the same way. And I love Academic Search Premier because it is a multidisciplinary database. So it does have access to a lot of different journals and a lot of different subject areas. But what I also think is cool about Academic Search Premier is that you can add a few extra databases to expand your search. So since I am going to be looking at a topic related to sports, I'm going to add a database that I like called Sports Discus. Okay. And I did that by clicking Choose Databases, and I just scrolled down until I found Sports Discus. So we see our search box here. This is where we're going to enter keywords or phrases for our searching. And we can also see our Boolean operators here. So Boolean operators are what we use to add keywords to our search. The three that you will need to know are called and, or, and not. And will actually narrow down your search because and means you are telling the database to search for articles that specifically mention 2 terms, whereas or will give you more results because it's telling the database to search one term or another term, and then not will remove specific terms from your search. So if I'm writing my op-ed about the pay gap in professional sports, looking specifically at women's soccer, I might use terms such as women's soccer or football, since that is another word for soccer. And I want to look up equal pay or wage gap, since that is another term I can use for equal pay. And I just want to see what comes up. Okay, wow. So I have gotten 4,600 results, and I definitely need to narrow that down. So there are a few ways that I might narrow down my search. One way is to do that by source type, and we can see all the different limiters down here on the side of my screen. So because I only want to look for those scholarly peer-reviewed sources, I'm going to click on Limit to Scholarly Peer-Reviewed Sources. And I've still got over 2,000 results. So another way that I can narrow down my search is by date. And I am looking for really recent information. So I'm going to go back about 10 years to 2010 in my search, which still gives me over 1,400 results. So there's a lot of different ways that you can narrow down a search. Like I mentioned, journals can be hyper-specific to a certain type, to a certain sliver of a field. So you could search by publication and pick a specific journal that you might want to look through. You are never expected to know the name of every single journal in your field, but it's going to be a really great way to know that whatever article you're looking for, it had to be published in that very specific journal. But one of my favorite ways to filter down a search is to use the thesaurus term. So the thesaurus term are terms that the authors of the articles have identified as additional keywords they've used in their for their article for searching. So I can take a look at different thesaurus terms, and I know that pay equity really aligns with what I'm looking for. So I'll click on pay equity and hit update. And now I'm down to 80 articles, which is a lot more manageable and easier to read through than that original 4,600 that we got. So what I can do is I can scroll through these really quickly, take a look at the titles, and see if anything is really speaking to me as a researcher. In order to read an article, I can just click on the hyperlink for the title, and there I'll be taken to the abstract, which is that one paragraph summary about an article, and all of the relevant citation information that you will need for your citations later, including the journal name, the volume, issue number, date, etc. And there I will also be able to find a PDF of my article. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my database demonstration today. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to discussing my approaches to teaching with you soon.